For the last few years, something has been happening quietly in the background of global finance. Something that has not happened once in modern history.
China is relinking its currency to gold. In simple words, China is trying to rebuild how money works. And if this continues, it may become the most important financial story you hear this year. I noticed it after watching a TFTC podcast, and honestly, it changed the way I see the entire world economy.
Some people call this the debasement trade, but what's happening is way bigger, way more strategic, and way more coordinated.
Over the last few years, the People's Bank of China has become the single largest buyer of gold in the world.
China and its allies have been buying gold and simultaneously selling U.S. Treasury bonds, slowly weakening the dollar's reserve currency dominance. At the same time, China built the Shanghai Gold Exchange, which has become the largest physical gold marketplace on Earth.
They recently opened a new vault in Hong Kong, and they're building a network of secure vaults across BRICS countries, something that's being called the Gold Corridor. This corridor will allow nations that hold yuan to convert it into physical gold. That gives the Chinese currency something the dollar lost a long time ago: trust. Because you can't freeze gold, you can't print gold, you can't debase it, and it can't default. It is the oldest, purest trust mechanism in human history.
In July 2025, gold was reclassified globally as a Basel Roman III Tier 1 asset, meaning that banks can now count gold exactly the same way they count cash or treasuries.
But the theory is that the next step is even more powerful. Gold can be upgraded again to something called a high-quality liquid asset, or HQLA. If that happens, gold will be usable inside repo markets, the heart of the global financial system, for lending, borrowing, and financing giant projects. China has been systematically solving every obstacle that prevented gold and the yuan from competing with the dollar.
This is the blueprint for a parallel financial system outside the U.S. and outside the IMF, built on physical collateral rather than trust in U.S. policy.
My goal in this deep dive is to explain what's happening to gold, what the Gold Corridor is, how it works, how China intends to use it to fund development around the world, and what this means for
the dollar, the U.S., interest rates, commodities, and even Bitcoin. So let's get into it. Hi, my name is HRI Jik.
Hope you're doing well. Come for the finance and stay for the gold. To understand why the world is searching for an alternative to the dollar, you first need to understand trust.
For decades, around 70% of global reserves were stored in U.S. dollars, primarily U.S. Treasury bonds, because they were considered the safest assets in the world.
But that trust cracked in 2022, when the U.S. seized $300 billion of Russia's reserves overnight.
Whether you agree with the politics or not, the message was loud and clear. If your reserves are in dollars, they might not really be yours.
They can be frozen with a decision. Countries ask themselves, if this can be done to a nuclear power like Russia, what about us next time we disagree?
That single moment accelerated a global shift. Emerging market, central banks began selling treasuries and buying gold.
Slowly at first, then rapidly. When Trump started tariff threats against China, China's gold chart suddenly exploded.
Years of flat activity turned into the fastest accumulation of gold in modern history, and they weren't hiding it.
They were buying publicly because they wanted other nations to see it. They wanted to signal, look at all the gold we have.
We can reduce our reliance on U.S. treasuries, and so can you. Officially, China says it has around 300 tons of gold.
But estimates from Bloomberg, JP Morgan, and the World Gold Council suggest the real number might be closer to 3,000,050 tons once you include state banks and funds.
Meanwhile, the dollar's share of global reserves has fallen to the lowest level in decades. The trend is not a theory.
It is visible on every chart, but then something happened that very few people understand. For decades, gold was classified under Basel rules as a Tier 3 asset.
Banks could only count about half of its value. The financial system was intentionally designed to keep gold passive.
Then Basel Roman III upgraded gold to Tier 1. Suddenly, banks could count 100% of its value, but even then, gold still couldn't be used to borrow, lend, or finance anything.
It wasn't considered liquid enough. It wasn't HQLA. That's where China's strategy begins. China's plan is simple. Solve every problem that stopped gold from being usable in modern finance.
The first problem was trust and custody. Countries did not want their gold stored only in China. They wanted to see it, touch it, and access it. So China created the Gold Corridor, a network of interconnected vaults across BRICS countries, all linked to the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Every bar is tracked by serial number, purity, and ownership. It is, essentially, a physical blockchain.
Not digital, but real, decentralized custody, verifiable, redeemable, and auditable, that solved the first problem.
The second problem was volatility. You cannot use an asset for collateral if the price jumps around every day.
So instead of using daily spot price, China proposes using a moving average, like averaging the last 200 days of gold prices.
That smooths out volatility and makes gold stable enough to serve as collateral. The third step is where things get geopolitical.
China plans to use this system to finance the developing world. Africa, for example, produces up to a third of the world's gold, but lacks infrastructure. Under this new system, African nations can deposit their gold into the Shanghai Gold Exchange. Then China, through the new development bank, the BRICS Bank, can lend them yuan backed by that gold so they can build ports, highways, airports, power plants, or factories.
China gains influence, developing countries bypass the IMF, and all of it happens outside the dollar.
This is how gold becomes a de facto HQLA, even if the West never approves it. Gold stops being a shiny rock and becomes the foundation of a new financial system.
And here's where the United States comes back into the picture. Earlier this year, the U.S. began repatriating its gold from London back to American soil.
The official explanation was tariffs and audits, but that never really made sense. More likely, the U.S. knows exactly what China is building.
If the world shifts toward a system where physical gold must be redeemable, then custody becomes everything.
If the U.S. wants to remain competitive, it needs its gold physically inside its own borders. The U.S. officially holds about 8,000 tons of gold, the largest in the world. But a lot of it was historically stored or accounted for overseas. Bringing it home is a strategic move, not a coincidence.
So what does this mean for gold prices? Most major financial institutions hold around 20% of their reserves in gold or hard assets. But new guidelines from groups like Bank of America suggest this should rise to around 30%. That 10% gap represents roughly $2 trillion of new gold demand.
And because gold cannot be printed, that demand could push gold to levels we have never seen before.
Some analysts say gold could double within 5 years. That is not a prediction, but it is a realistic possibility.
So how does this affect investors, especially Bitcoin investors?
If you think about this from a geopolitical perspective, it suddenly makes sense why the prices of both gold and Bitcoin were likely suppressed for long periods.
If you are a nation that wants to accumulate alternatives to the dollar, why would you want their prices to explode before you've bought enough?
We are watching a split in real time. On one side, China and BRICS are building a system backed by something ancient, physical, tangible gold.
On the other side, the United States could counter with something built on technology, stable coins, tokenized assets,
and possibly Bitcoin.
Gold represents trust through time. Bitcoin represents trust through energy and math. China's model is about control and hard collateral.
America's model could be about openness and digital infrastructure. For the first time in modern history, we may be entering a world where there is no single global standard of money.
Instead, we could be shifting into a multi-monetary era, a gold-backed financial world led by China and BRICS.
A digital asset-backed financial world led by the US and the West. And people and countries will have the ability to choose which system they trust.
For the first time, money itself becomes competitive, and both systems could exist side by side.